most creepy driving horror stories. It was late when Hannah left the city. She'd spent the entire day in meetings, endless discussions that seemed to drag on forever, and now, finally, she was free. Exhausted, she slid into the driver's seat of her car, eager to put the day behind her. The road stretched out in front of her, the hum of the engine a comforting presence as she settled into the familiar rhythm of the drive home. The highway was mostly empty now, the usual rush-hour traffic long gone. Her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual as the darkness pressed in on her. The night felt heavier somehow, thicker, like the air itself was holding its breath. She glanced out of the window at the pitch-black sky, punctuated only by the distant shimmer of stars. The road felt empty, too empty. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It was just her imagination, she told herself. But the unease lingered, sitting at the back of her mind, tugging at her. Her phone buzzed from the passenger seat, snapping her out of her thoughts. Another notification. Probably her mom, or Sarah, she thought. She reached for it, feeling the familiar warmth of her phone in her hand as she unlocked the screen. There were several missed calls, one from her mom, one from Sarah, and an unknown number. She stared at the screen for a moment, her heart skipping. Something about the unknown number made her pause. Why hadn't they left a voicemail? The call from her mom was the first one she dialed back. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice strained with fatigue. "What's going on? Where are you?" Her mom's voice was sharp, full of an unease Hannah wasn't used to hearing. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Something feels off." Hannah frowned, her fingers tightening around the phone. "What do you mean?" "I'm just driving home, Mom. Everything's fine. I don't know, sweetie. I just have this feeling. Be careful, okay? Please." Before Hannah could say anything more, the call cut off. Her phone screen flickered and then went black, leaving her staring at it in confusion. She tried to redial, but there was no signal, just the eerie silence of a dropped call. "Ugh, not now," she muttered, tossing the phone back into the passenger seat. It could wait. She had enough to deal with. She focused on the road ahead, trying to shake off the feeling of her mom's warning. Everything was fine, but the darkness outside, it felt different tonight. There was something oppressive in the air, thick and suffocating. Even the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if it was taking her further away from everything familiar. As she drove, the headlights cast long, unsettling shadows across the trees that lined the highway. The fog was starting to roll in now, making the air feel even heavier, as though the world was closing in around her. Her grip tightened around the steering wheel. "No, stop it. It's just the fog. It's late, and I'm tired," she tried to convince herself. But there it was again. That feeling. The headlights from another car appeared in her rearview mirror, a single set of lights cutting through the fog. For a moment, Hannah felt a flash of relief. Another car, finally. At least she wasn't completely alone. But as the car got closer, she noticed something strange. The car was tailing her too closely, way too closely. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was it so close? She glanced at the rearview mirror again, her eyes darting to the headlights that seemed to be glued to her back bumper. It was as if the car wasn't just following her. It was stalking her. Her stomach clenched with unease. She pressed the gas pedal slightly, trying to put some distance between herself and the car. But it didn't work. The car stayed right behind her. What is going on? She started to speed up, but the other car mirrored her, its headlights flashing in her mirror like a relentless presence. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could almost hear the pounding in her ears. Her pulse quickened. Who drives this fast without headlights at night? It was like a game, like they were both racing down the empty road. But Hannah didn't want to play, not with whoever this was. Focus, focus. Her thoughts raced as she tried to think clearly. She had to get away from this car. She needed to lose it. There. A turnoff up ahead. A small back road she could take to shake the car off her tail. Without thinking, she swerved sharply to the right, taking the corner too quickly. Her tires screeched against the asphalt, but she didn't care. She just had to get away. For a moment, the car behind her was lost in the curves of the road, and she breathed a sigh of relief. It worked. But the sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. The fog was thicker now, swirling around her like an ocean, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of her. Her headlights barely cut through the dense fog, and the silence around her seemed to grow even heavier, as though the world had gone mute. She didn't hear the engine of the car anymore, didn't hear anything at all except her own breathing and the hum of the road beneath her tires. It's fine. You're fine. Hannah shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. But something in the air was different. The road was different. The trees that lined the road felt taller, closer. The air was colder, heavier, suffocating. Something was wrong. That's when she heard it, a noise, faint but growing louder, scraping, dragging against the side of her car. Her eyes snapped to the side, but all she saw was the darkness, the silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. The noise grew louder. It wasn't just scraping anymore. It was like someone or something was trying to climb onto the car. She slammed on the brakes, heart racing, but the noise continued. It felt like it was coming from all sides, all at once. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. Hannah's breath was shallow, her hands trembling on the wheel. Her heart pounded in her chest, her entire body tense, ready to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The car wouldn't start. She twisted the key again, her panic rising. Please, please start. But nothing happened. The engine was dead. No. She tried again. Nothing. The headlights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Hannah froze, her pulse racing in her throat. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked out the window. Was anyone there? And then she saw him. A figure, tall, dark, standing just outside the car. Her breath hitched in her chest. This can't be happening. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, too still, too quiet, too wrong. She tried to speak, but her voice was a whisper. Excuse me? Can you help me? No response. Please, no. Hannah fumbled with the door handle, but it was locked. She didn't want to open the door anyway. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And then, he spoke. His voice was low, cold. You shouldn't be here. His words sent a chill straight to her core. I'm not supposed to be here? He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing up the faint light from the car's broken headlights. You crossed the line, he said, his words barely a whisper in the night. You can't leave now. Her hands were shaking, and the air seemed to tighten around her chest. Leave? What did he mean? What was he talking about? She tried the door handle again, frantically pressing, pulling, but the lock wouldn't budge. Please, she whispered, terror rising in her throat. I just want to go home. Please. But the man didn't answer. He just stood there, looming over her. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Hannah didn't wait a second longer. She tried the key one more time, and this time, the car roared to life. Without hesitation, she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, speeding down the road, her heart pounding as she glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And the road behind her? It seemed to stretch on forever, always the same, always pulling her back. This is the most scary driving horror story number 2. It was a crisp, unsettling night when Tracy found herself driving down a stretch of highway that seemed too familiar, yet eerily unfamiliar. The kind of road that would normally feel like home. But tonight? Tonight it felt wrong. She had driven this route so many times before, but tonight was different. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like dark fingers, as if trying to grab hold of her car. The air felt thick, pressing against the windows as the car moved forward. Her tired eyes blinked rapidly as she tried to focus. Just get home, she told herself, but there was no comfort in the thought. She was exhausted, her body drained from a long day at work, and all she wanted was to be home in her bed, safe and sound. The kind of night where everything feels quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the engine was the only sound, and even that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. The road stretched ahead of her, seemingly endless. The headlights barely cut through the fog rolling in, leaving just a sliver of the path visible. Tracy swallowed hard. The road felt oppressive. Every mile, every passing tree felt like they were closing in on her. Come on, just keep driving, she thought, gripping the wheel tighter. But even with the headlights cutting through the dark, it felt like the road was closing in. She glanced at the rearview mirror, as if instinctively knowing something wasn't right. And then she saw it. A car. A pair of headlights too close behind her. Too close for comfort. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. It's just another car, she told herself. But that voice in her head couldn't silence the unease spreading through her chest. The car was following her. It wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was just there. Silent, distant, but always there. Her pulse quickened. No. She couldn't shake the feeling. Her foot pressed down on the gas without realizing it, pushing the car to go faster. But the headlights behind her? They stayed the same. Too close. Too constant. She glanced at the mirror again, her eyes wide with fear. But the car was right there. Closer now. Almost too close. Her breath became shallow. There was something about it that didn't sit right. The air felt colder. The fog seemed thicker, rolling in like an unnatural presence. It's just my imagination, she tried to convince herself. But the voice inside her grew louder. You're being followed. The whisper. It came out of nowhere, barely audible at first, just a faint sound in the back of her mind. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard it, clear as day. Stop. The voice wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was real. Something inside her froze. She wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. A sharp breath caught in her throat, and her eyes darted to the rearview mirror again. There was no doubt now. The car was still there, hovering behind her like a dark, oppressive force. Her mind raced. Why hadn't they passed her? Why were they still there? She looked ahead at the road, hoping that if she kept driving, everything would make sense again. But the fog only thickened, the air growing heavier with every mile. And then, there it was again. That whisper. Louder this time. Stop. It was more than just words. It felt like a command, a warning. Her hands trembled, but she didn't let go of the wheel. The car in the rear-view mirror was so close now, it felt like it was breathing down her neck. But she couldn't stop. No. She couldn't. What if she did? What if she pulled over? What would happen then? The headlights in the mirror seemed to dim, flicker, and then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Tracy's heart raced. The car was gone. She stared wide-eyed at the empty road behind her. Nothing. The darkness stretched on, endless and silent. No headlights, no car, nothing. What the hell? She slammed her foot on the gas, speeding down the road, but no matter how fast she drove, the same eerie feeling clung to her like a shadow. The fog surrounded her, pressing in on all sides, and her hands grew slick on the steering wheel. What was going on? Had she imagined it all? She tried to steady her breathing, but it was useless. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the road ahead felt so long, so endless. Was she still being followed? Was she just waiting for something to happen? And then, just as she thought she might lose control of the fear creeping into her mind, the road ahead opened up, the fog beginning to dissipate, and there it was, the familiar sign for her exit. She had made it. She was almost home. But even as she took the turn, the unease remained. It never quite left her. She couldn't explain it. What had just happened? Her hands were shaking. The car was still too quiet. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the car right behind her, ready to catch up. But there was nothing. No headlights. No shadows. Only the road. Tracy pulled into her driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. She sat there for a moment, her breath shallow, unsure if she should even get out of the car. The feeling didn't leave her, not even when she turned off the engine. She just stared at her house, as if waiting for something to happen. Some sign. Some proof that she was okay. Her fingers fumbled with the car door, and she finally stepped out, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She locked the car behind her and walked up the steps to the front door, glancing over her shoulder one last time. The night was silent. Still. As though nothing had ever happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling. The whispers had stopped, but the dread, the sense that something had been there, just out of reach, was still with her. It had followed her from the highway, into her driveway, and now into her own home. She closed the door behind her, but the unease lingered, like a shadow cast over her every step. She wasn't alone. She never truly had been. Something was waiting. Something would always be waiting. Tracy didn't know when it would come back. She only knew that it would. And so, even in the comfort of her own home, she could still feel the weight of it, the oppressive presence that she couldn't escape. She had been followed, and no matter where she went, she could never be sure if the road had truly ended. This is the scariest driving horror story number 3. It was late. Too late. Pippa felt the weight of the night pressing down on her, the kind of weight that made her shoulders ache and her eyes heavy. The hum of the tires against the road was the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. It was almost like she wasn't even moving, like the world outside her car had stopped and she was floating in some endless stretch of nothingness. She'd made this drive countless times before. Long shifts at the hospital often meant she found herself on the road in the dead of night, the highway stretching endlessly in front of her, the trees and shadows flickering in the corner of her eyes. Normally, it didn't bother her. She was used to it. But tonight? Tonight felt wrong. The rain came out of nowhere, pouring down in sheets, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the road visible. It had started softly at first, but now it was relentless. Each droplet hit the windshield with a sharp tap, almost like it was trying to warn her. Something was off. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm herself. It's just the rain, she told herself, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. It's just the weather playing tricks on you. But she couldn't shake it. The air felt heavy, oppressive. The darkness outside seemed to stretch forever, swallowing everything up. Her headlights barely cut through the haze, and the shadows, those long looming shadows, kept shifting, as if they were alive. She glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. It was the kind of hour where everything seemed quieter, more isolating. The road was empty, as it usually was at this hour. Just her and the occasional flicker of lightning cutting through the sky. Nothing to see but endless road and rain. Then, she saw it. At first it was small, just a faint pair of headlights in her rearview mirror. But they weren't fading in the distance. They were getting closer. Too close. Her heart skipped a beat. She adjusted her mirror, staring at the reflection of the headlights. The car behind her had to be too close. Was it tailgating? It wasn't normal. There wasn't another car on the road. There never was at this time of night. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, and her pulse quickened. She glanced at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She was just driving. And yet, the car behind her seemed to match her every move. She tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts from her mind. But it wasn't going away. The car was there, and it was getting closer. She could see the headlights in her mirror, almost blinding now. They were right there, almost as if they were breathing down her neck. Her chest tightened. She needed to get away. She hit the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest, but the car behind her, it stayed right there. It didn't back off, didn't slow down. It followed her every move. Her stomach twisted in knots. This isn't right. Her heart raced, and she could feel her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the road ahead, but the darkness seemed to stretch out longer now, swallowing up the light of her headlights. I need to pull over. She had to. She was losing it. But just as she thought it, she glanced back at the mirror again, and for a split second the headlights were gone. Gone. She blinked rapidly, her heart thumping in her chest. What the hell? The road was empty again. No car in sight. No lights. She scanned the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the rain. Her breath caught in her throat. What just happened? Was she imagining it? It wasn't possible. There was no way the car could have just vanished like that. But before she could even process it, she heard it. A soft tap. At first, it was so faint she wasn't sure she'd actually heard it. She blinked, looking around, trying to make sense of the noise. Was it the rain? Number. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It came again, a little louder this time, and Pippa's blood ran cold. She glanced upward. The roof. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from the roof of her car. Someone, or something, was on top of it. She could feel her hands trembling on the wheel, her fingers frozen to the steering column. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of joke? Was someone playing a prank? But then, that wouldn't explain how the car had vanished. It didn't make sense. The tapping continued, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles turning white. She was paralyzed with fear, but she forced herself to focus. She had to do something. Anything. Without thinking, she slammed her foot onto the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. She swerved, trying to shake whatever was on the roof, but the tapping didn't stop. It was still there, relentless. Oh God, what is it? Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything to stop this. She glanced in her mirrors again, but the road was empty. No cars, no headlights. The tapping continued. Pippa couldn't take it anymore. She had to stop. She had to pull over. She slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and the sound of the rain pounding against the roof filled the silence. The tapping stopped. The quiet was unbearable. Her hands were still shaking, her breath shallow as she sat frozen in the car. What now? Her mind couldn't grasp what had just happened. The tapping was gone, but the fear remained, clawing at her chest. She slowly, cautiously, checked her mirrors again. No one. No headlights, no strange shape in the dark. The road was empty. Still. Silent. A moment passed. 2. Pippa slowly exhaled, the fear slowly starting to ebb, but she knew deep down that something wasn't right. Something was out there. She shifted into drive, her foot pressing gently on the gas. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the empty road ahead. The tapping was gone, The car was gone, but the unease remained. As she drove on, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road stretched on in front of her, dark and endless, but the thought that someone, or something, had been with her out there, lingering in the shadows, never left her. And when she finally got home, she stayed in her car for a long time, staring at the empty road outside, the rain still falling like it had no end. She knew one thing for sure: she would never drive that stretch of road again, not without looking over her shoulder, wondering who or what was still out there.